So, can philosophers think quantum physics? If philosophers are going to extrapolate upon the revolutionary work in quantum physics, particularly since the Copenhagen interpretation coalesced a century ago, we need to ask what exactly the parameters are around this conversation. Indeed, up until a century ago, it was very common for philosophers to interpret current scientific discoveries and engage in scientific debate. We can, for example, look to Bergson's debates with Einstein over the nature of time. And more relevant for this paper, we can look to the history of German idealism and the development of its natural philosophy that saw its typical suspects, Kant, Schelling, Fichte, Hegel, debating the nature of the atomic, the cosmic, the organic, and the inorganic. Today in our field, and I speak to my colleagues here coming from a Hegelian Lacanian tradition, and we're here for this Ljubljana School panel, we're overall a bit hesitant to engage with the sciences. Indeed, is psychoanalysis a science? This question Milan Delar asked in his 2009 essay, Freud and the Political. He writes, quote, "What is at stake in science in establishing a scientific field is the guarantee of the repeatable, whereas in psychoanalysis, one constantly deals only with the singular, the singularity of symptoms, the singularity of a particular unconscious." End quote. Psychoanalysis relies on the contingent formation of the symptom, that it's utterly unique to each individual, and thus irreducible and unreplicable. We can look to the broader, shakier standing of psychoanalysis within the sciences. It is psychology as a field that prides itself on being more formalized and modeled after repeated experimentation, making it more akin to its scientific brethren in the university. Perhaps it's for this reason, the strange inversion of psychoanalysis' scientific structure, that it's based upon contingency, indeed that it absolutizes contingency, and that's really critical, that makes work in the field of the Ljubljana School a bit resistant to science writ large. Of course, there are two notable exceptions to this. Adrian Johnston has worked extensively to theorize evolutionary biology from a Hegelian as well as a Freudian Lacanian lens. His transcendental materialism has sought to find horizons upon which we can identify the emergence of the human from nature without reducing spirit to the brute materiality of nature itself. And of course, the other exception is Slavoj Žižek, who has for decades now theorized on quantum physics as it relates to, for example, retroactivity, eventual history, subjectivity, politics. Žižek has doubled down on quantum physics in the last few years, culminating in his recent book, Quantum History. He does this in spite of skepticism from many within our field. While the most articulated critique stems from Adrian Johnston, who sees Žižek's Schellingian analysis of quantum physics as a ground of pre-existence to be compromising. Why are there two realities, a quantum ground and then our everyday reality, not simply one reality? But in spite of this, I think that people aren't really engaging with Žižek's actual arguments, and that there are several broad concerns here that I'm going to articulate now. So first, there's a general skepticism towards the hard sciences because they're based on induction and thus open to fault. The hard sciences tend to be veridical rather than absolute, if I'm to borrow from Badiou here. They attempt to put the unruliness of nature into a box of logic, a box that will always exceed, pop out of, break open at the edges. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel writes that the scientific method advances only an inductive method of probability, and thus clearly can't lead to truth properly. He writes, I quote, "The assertion that if you pick up a stone off the ground and drop it, then it falls, does not at all require the experiment to have been made with all stones. More likely, it just says that this experiment must have been tried with a good many stones, and from what we can with the greatest probability or with perfect right by analogy, draw an inference about the rest." End quote. Indeed, for Hegel, a true Wissenschaft, a true science, can only be one in which reason operates upon itself as an object. The second critique is the methodological question that I would situate as questioning the link between the humanistic subjective experience and the physical reality of the quantum world. Žižek, for example, links the superposition of photons and the wave function at the quantum level to superpositions in history. He argues that possibilities which have real effects at the quantum level are akin to possibilities which have real effects at the historical level. The key example he gives here is that of the ANC in South Africa, that as South Africa ended its civil war, dismantling apartheid, the peace was kept due to the real threat and real possibility of violence by the ANC. So this is the methodological question, which I situate as follows. Can we leap from the particle to the political? The third critique, which is very specific to Žižek, is does he know enough about quantum physics? And I really think that we should set this one aside. No, genuinely. To erect barriers between the fields of study is a product of university discourse that forbids thought based on imagined walls between departments. If we focus on some of the key takeaways from quantum physics, we should be able to discuss them. Just as we as philosophers theorize at length about space, time, and nature without being hard scientists, about consciousness without being neuroscientists, I argue, it's controversial, but that we can think about materiality without being physicists. And of course, as mentioned earlier, this is part of a long tradition from Plato to Hegel and so on. So here I'm going to implicitly respond to these two critiques through an examination of several key takeaways from quantum physics as articulated by Zizek with some humble buttressing of my own. This is my thesis. Quantum physics demonstrates the gap between nature and thought is actually not an epistemic gap, but is rather an ontological gap in which nature emerges from indeterminate placelessness to determinate place. Because quantum physics is a system of thought that operates reflexively upon itself, what is worth commenting upon as philosophers is the ways in which this reflexivity demonstrates the contradictions at the heart of an observed nature. This paper has 6 sections. 1, quantum physics is a reflexive science. In his 1996 book, Indivisible Remainder, Zizek points out that what is revolutionary in quantum physics is that the observer is part of the experiment. It is a reflexive study of itself as part of its own product. Werner Heisenberg argued that quantum physics is entirely distinct from classical physics, which he describes as, quote, that idealization in which we speak about the world as entirely separated from ourselves. Quantum physics, Heisenberg writes, does not simply explain nature, but is a, quote, part of the interplay between nature and ourselves. This is precisely the novelty of the theories developed by Hegel and later Marx, Freud, and Lacan. For Hegel, reason emerges as it operates upon itself, transforming itself as our object of thought and as the mechanism of thought. Through reason, we can analyze the parapraxes of our reason in order to then move through the various trappings of logic toward the absolute idea, which is a thinking which thinks itself thinking, the reflexivity and self-creation of reason itself. For Marx, his analysis is likewise a reflexive analysis. To analyze the proletariat is to transform the proletariat into a revolutionary class, thus shaping and radicalizing the object of thought from the perspective of the proletariat that thinks. Lacan quotes Baudelaire in Seminar 10, Je suis le plaie et le couteau, I am the cut and the knife. The subject is both its production and itself. It's not only split, the subject is the split itself as the radical negativity of the unconscious that does not weld the subject into one, but maintains an imbalance critical to the subject's constitution. So that's a lesser sense of reflexivity, but as a theory, psychoanalysis instrumentalizes this insight within the clinic. Freud clearly recognized that a subject's memories can be reworked in analysis into a genuinely reconfigured past. Hence, psychoanalysis reflexively transforms its object of analysis through analysis itself. So hence, a central part of Zizek's work that the observer is the cut in reality, that we are the gap that situates reality, is here articulated in the theoretical structure of quantum physics. It's not possible to subtract the act of observation from a physical system within quantum physics, meaning a host of conclusions are drawn regarding the impact of observation upon a system. For example, the collapse of a wave function into the placing of a particular particle. The collapse only happens due to observation. The object of analysis transforms with observation. The logical construction of nature changes nature itself. That's the central thesis as well. So as Heisenberg posited, the revolution of quantum physics is that the external world is not knowable if only we have the right tools. Its knowability is inextricably tied to our tools. Thus, quantum physics is a system of knowledge that inculcates a very particular truth, the one that Hegel knew very well, that nature is a concept. As a concept, reason transforms the concept of nature. Thus, any interaction with a system in quantum physics is quite literally subjectivity made objective. In our knowing of the world, we render it objective. Part 2, nature is ontologically incomplete. Were nature complete, all would be determined. There would be no room, there would be no space for accident, for contingency, for chance. Hegel is very clear that nature is simply, I quote, necessity and contingency, and likewise that no philosophy of nature will ever be complete because nature exceeds logical constraints. The critical way to read an externalized, spatialized nature in Hegel, I argue, is that there is always more space for logical determinations, more space for the novelties of nature to emerge. Nature is infinitely arrangeable by logic. Hegel discusses this in the Phenomenology as well, precisely because nature exceeds logic, and that's really central. So here we can ask with quantum physics, are determinations of nature merely epistemic? Today, in quantum physics, certain measurements are simultaneously impossible to gather within a given system, such as the speed and the placement of an electron. This is known as quantum indeterminacy. Katherine Everitt, in her 2007 book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, which was very critical for Zizek's development, argues that Bohr's complementarity principle, i.e. the more determinate the speed of the electron, the less determinate its position, and vice versa. She argues that this is not one of epistemic constraint, but one of ontological incompletion. The particle really has no velocity when it has a position, and it has no position when it has a velocity. That's the critical thing to wrap our heads around. This is also Schrödinger's cat kind of idea. So in his 2023 article, From Quantum History to Quantum Reality, Zizek articulates his argument that reality is pas tout, not all incomplete. For Zizek, there's a certain inability of reality to add up to a whole, making it less than one. Indeed, it's quantum physics that pokes a hole in the big other. There is no objectively static nature held in place, but only an emergent nature that is a product of observation and atomistic interactions. Zizek writes in Quantum History, quote, "There's no zero level at which things, or rather processes, just happen without being in some sense observed," end quote. So what I add to this argument that this is a distinctly spatial question, one in which nature's one absolute, like the one absolute thing about nature is that it is external, for Hegel, that this guarantees its incompletion in the form of always more space. If it's external, it is spatial as such. So that nature is incomplete on an ontological level in specific regard to position and velocity, velocity itself being, of course, a paradox of position, a positionality inscribed against positionality. You can think of Zeno's tortoise. This is a clear moment where epistemology and ontology collapse. We know a position, there is a position. These two statements can't be disentangled. Here we can use this insight to move toward a theory of nature in which nature maintains a certain ontological indeterminacy, in which, let me be clear, nature clearly exists. It simply exists as ontologically indeterminate until it is determined. This is like my central thesis as well. I have several central theses. Part 3, nature is not self-same. One of the most contentious aspects of Zizek's analysis is that of the Higgs field in his 2013 text, Less Than Nothing. The Higgs field is a vacuum that registers an energetic pulsation, which proves to Zizek that something is energetically cheaper than nothing. That's his quote. So here, Zizek argues that there's some negative pulsation that's beating on within the void. Lorenzo Chiesa notably critiques this argument in The Knot too, arguing that this is effectively an animistic and explicitly anti-Lacanian reading. Indeed, this highlights perhaps one of the tensions in Zizek's work, that when we look, for example, at the work of Hegel and the void, it's evident that the void is not a neutral nothingness, but a charged nothingness, a nothingness that moves and precipitates logical momentum. But can we say the same thing about nature? One way to read this is that Zizek is misrepresenting an ontic argument from quantum physics as ontological. But is that what's really happening? Like I discussed earlier, quantum physics is a reflexive science. Not only is the observer a cut into nature that renders nature objective, but quantum physics likewise renders its objects of analysis as imbued with a contradictory core. What we learn from Hegel is that objects aren't self-same. Nothing, not even nothingness, not even the void, die Leere, is self-same. A does not simply equal A. There are two A's that must traverse a gap between them, that must navigate the negativity, and this is critical, the empty space between them to reach a unity with itself. For Hegel, unity is not self-identicality, but it's a traversal of difference in a process imbued with moments of contradiction. Thus, the void of the Higgs field is not self-same. The Higgs field is a void that has been emptied out once more, a pulsating void containing within itself its own contradiction. Indeed, just as nothingness in a dialectical rendering is never at a standstill, neither is the void of nature. Part 4, the thing in itself is a mistake. Quantum physics shows that there is no thing in itself lurking beneath the surface, beneath its misfiring of its appearance. Or to put it more radically, the thing in itself really is this misfiring. Even the void appears as not totally empty. And so in this radical way, right, Sein ist Schein, as Hegel writes in the Logic, being really is appearance. That's a big point. Light behaves as both a particle and a wave. Here again, we have one of the most central breakthroughs in quantum physics that demonstrates a contradictory relationship within the behavior of reality at a very basic level. To Zizek, we do not need a new theory that reconciles the particle and the wave contra classical physics, but instead we need to recognize that what we're looking at is a fundamental antagonism within nature itself. I add to Zizek's analysis here that the tension is really a question of the measurement of reality. Is reality smooth or striated, to borrow this language from Deleuze's distinction in Mieux Plateau? In a very strong sense, this is what materiality is. It is this precise gap within our measurement. For at the heart of nature's paradox is that it is a concept to us, and yet it certainly exists without our cognition of it. How can we render this paradox without relying on an omniscient big other to hold nature in place? Part 5, the concept of conceptlessness. The hard kernel at the heart of this dialectic is, what is the concept of nature without concept? And this can't simply be an emptied out concept. This must be the emptied out concept of externality. We arrive at a concept of indeterminacy that persists in its externality. We arrive at space in itself, an emptied out externality. But we know that nature isn't simply emptiness. So how do we account for materiality? In an unconceptualized nature, material is also indeterminate until it is determined. It is emptied out of determination while persisting in its externality. So this is how I propose we think of a dematerialized materialism, that materiality boiled down to something atomistic, to some countable presentation drawn from the multiplicity of nature, that we conceive of these incisions as negations of nature's indeterminacy, a negation of negation from which we count materiality. So really what the atom is, in a sort of an irreducible sense, is a negation of the indeterminacy of nature. This is negation of negation and not like a positivist reading of nature, which I think is what we should be thinking about. So in poking a hole in the big other, in asserting that reality is not omnisciently held together as knowable in its totality and moreover is not a totality, we can reconceive of nature as first and foremost a spatialized indeterminacy that is nonetheless real. 6, my conclusion. So in quantum history, Zizek writes that quantum physics presents, quote, a radical closure. There is no meta-language. We cannot step on our own shoulders to see our own limitation, end quote. The basic framework of quantum physics presents a strange relationship within classical physics, one in which classical notions break down as the outside world is not outside in a static way, but emergent with interaction and categorization. Rather than trying to iron out classical physics and quantum physics, Zizek challenges us to see this gap between them as an antagonism, one that signals yet another collapse from the flux of possibility to our striated organized world. Regarding the 2 critiques I posited earlier, first that we should be skeptical of the inductive scientific method, I argue that 1, we should focus on the framework of quantum physics and its radical move towards a scientific truth that the observer is entangled with her observations. And 2, we should take seriously that nature is indeterminate until it is determined, that the lack of knowledge of quantum physics demonstrates that what this lack of knowledge that quantum physics demonstrates is actually some of its most compelling knowledge. To the second critique on the move from the particle to the political, we need to keep in mind that quantum physics is not a theory of nature, but a theory of our interaction with nature. And thus, an analysis of the subject is actually precisely what we need in our discussion of nature, and indeed is always part of nature's logical organization and emergence. Thank you.